We are. Welcome, everyone. Chip Heath is going to be popping in and joining us in just a moment. I was just with him backstage. This is a very exciting opportunity that we all have to hear his session, Making Numbers Count, the Art and Science of Communicating Numbers. So let's give Chip just one moment and he'll be with us. All right.
Yeah.
There he is. All right. Welcome, Chip.
Thank you for having me.
This is terrific here. Very exciting. As I have said to everyone here, welcome. We have author Chip Heath, Making Numbers Count, the Art and Science of Communicating Numbers. And this is a book that I've been telling everyone I'm so excited about because it really gets into the art of storytelling with numbers, which is something that is much needed here. So today I'm here with Chip Heath. He's a professor at Stanford Business School, and he's written 4 books that have actually hit the New York Times bestsellers list. The book Made to Stick, which is closest to the topic today, spent 2 years on the Business Week bestseller list and has been translated into more than 30 languages, including Thai, Arabic, and Lithuanian. But today, as I mentioned before, he's going to talk to us about his new book, Making Numbers Count. So I'm turning it over to you, Chip.
Oh, thank you. So making numbers count is a difficult thing to do. And I'm going to see if I can get my slides geared up here. There we are. And that's fine.
And we can see them on our side, so you're good.
All right.
They're just coming back up.
Let's see, I can't see them on my side. There we go.
No, it's just a blank screen now. I saw them when they were all small.
All right, so they're small, and there's going large here. Let's try that. How about that?
Nope.
All right. It says we're sharing a window. All right, I'm going to try one more time here.
The joy of technology.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got this.
Screen share. Window. Window with the slides. Share. How about that? You see the small ones.
Okay, now we see the small ones.
See the large ones?
No. Try using the top bar with the slideshow and see if that'll make a difference there.
All right, top bar. Go backstage. It says.
No, on your PowerPoint slide where it says home, insert, draw, design, transitions.
Yep.
Try the slideshow one.
Okay.
In there and just see if that. And then from beginning.
How's that? Still nothing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're sorry. We have tried this before and it was working a few minutes ago. All right, stem lines.
Just bear with us, everyone. It's always interesting when you have technical difficulties here, but I think we've all experienced this within our last year and a half, whether it's been with Zoom or some other form of technology there. So right now we have Chip Heath, and he's just we're getting his slides enlarged there so we can all see them and not feel like we have to look through a magnifier. But here we go. And
still nothing.
Okay, hold on. I'm getting tech support. Um, so Chip, I'm going to have you, it's his app. Click on that backstage. Hold on.
Okay, go backstage.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on. I just sent a note, so he's getting tech support. So while we're just waiting for Chip just to get his presentation back up, as we know, all of this always happens here. So he's, yes, we're working on closing that out, so it's something on his side. But I wanted to just take this opportunity, and I'll just do a little bit of a recap of kind of where we are in this learning journey. It's amazing because we have participants that are all over the world. We're also recording this because we realize that people are going to watch this at different times of the day and night. So a couple things is that we started off the summit really talking about these three key principles about integrated STEM and the importance of integrated STEM, really shifting it from being just an acronym that typically occurs within science class to something that is connected across all of the subject areas. So that science, technology, engineering, math, literacy, art, coding, robotics, everything starts to connect in a seamless fashion. And that's why we base it off of those three principles. One, we respect each discipline. Two, we look for authentic connections. And three, we leverage that back to careers. Because if students understand, well, why am I doing this or what's the possibilities, they're much more likely to be engaged in their learning. We then had an amazing opportunity to hear from Dr. Vijay Kumar, who is the Associate Dean for Open Learning and the Executive Director for the Jamil Abdul Latif World Education Lab at MIT. And I am always impressed when I hear Dr. Kumar talk about it because I love his passion around the practice of consistency. And so often, as he says, it's very easy to throw those buzzwords around, but it really comes to sticking with it. And when we continue to stick with it and that consistency builds, then we really get to that transformational process there. We then had an amazing opportunity to hear from, I consider, four leaders in STEM education, from Steve Barbado from ITEA, David Barnes from NCTM, Geraldine Gooding from ASEE, and Christina Royce, who's a professor of teacher education and co-director of MAT in STEM at Shippensburg University, as well as she's affiliated with various science organizations. And those folks really had the opportunity to discuss with us about taking our lessons learned from the past and how do we project that in terms of moving forward. And then we had a unique opportunity to hear from the NAACP at New York State. And this was very, very powerful because the NAACP has been around for over 100 years and really focusing on civil rights for individuals. And what's so passionate about them is that they're so focused on the education system as really being that opportunity. And when COVID happened and the pandemic hit and we saw that disconnect that students had with technology, we really were able to move this work forward. So, and they didn't just give out the tools. That gap became very real and looked at a process that really incorporated the learning. So to create that tool to be powerful, but to also move it forward. And then we had Stephen Pruitt. And, you know, as he talked about STEM and talked about the transformation of what has happened. And again, I think the theme is consistent. We've learned a lot during the pandemic. And, you know, we've learned a lot and we have to take those lessons learned in order to move the work forward. So it's, as I said, always a pleasure to hear there. And then, wow, the NASA All-Star team. What a powerful bunch of women that were there. It's great to hear from them, that connection there. And I love how it's getting more and more easier to kind of field the information that NASA has. And again, if you haven't joined the NASA Express newsletter, no matter where you are in the world, it's a very, very powerful tool. And next, we're going to be having Chip Heath. He's going to be jumping on board with us here. I'm taking a look here because he's just actually going to end up sending me his slides, and I got them here. And so I'm going to download them. And he's going to come back on stage. And then we're going to start his presentation here. So just give me 1 second. And from the beginning. All right, I just need to escape there. I'm coming back here. And okay, I'm going to have him come back on stage. You're seeing all the ins and outs. And I'm going to go ahead as he's coming on stage. I will share my screen. Okay, here he comes. All right. Give him 1 second here.
All right, we're back.
All right, we're back. Great. I have mine up, and I'm going to go ahead, start from the beginning. So here we are. It's all you.
All right. So I'm seeing, Kelly, my slides, but they're not queued up.
So you're not seeing.
So you see the full page version of your slide?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing that. How about the rest of you backstage?
Sal, can you just let me know if you're seeing the slides in full? Okay. So give me 1 second. We're going to try something else here. Do you see them in a larger format now?
They're in a larger format. That's good. Very
okay.
clever.
Let's go with that.
All right. So we're going to be talking about numbers. And numbers, I think it's fair to say, are becoming more important in society. So if you think about your workplace and the number of numbers that you talk about on a daily or weekly basis, they're probably increasing. In fact, the GRE has recently recognized this because the verbal section is no longer verbal. It's verbal stuff about numbers. And about 15 to 20% of the points now are coming from interpretation of data and interpretation of tables. But people disagree about their ability with numbers. And if we can come down a little bit, Kelly. So there are lots of people that say, I'm not a numbers person. And when it becomes tragic is when people are saying, I'm not a numbers person and I don't expect my child to be good with numbers because they inherit it, they come by it naturally. Well, what I want to argue based on the scientific research is that nobody is a natural at numbers. And in fact, let me give you a brief demonstration of this. We all throw around the terms billion and million very consistently, and we know that a billion is bigger than a million. But how much bigger is it? Well, let me give you a scenario where there's a lottery, and if you win the lottery, the good news is you get to spend the money, but you have to spend it at $50,000 a day, and so that's a little bit of constraint. And so suppose you win the lottery and you win $1 million. How long do your winnings last? Well, the first day you get up and you make down payments on a few research, a few trips that you've been wanting to take. I'm just kind of anticipating now what's happening because all my punchlines are revealed by the side. But you go out and you spend for 20 days $50,000 a day. How long does it take to spend $1 billion? The answer is 55 years. And that's a number that shocks most people. We have no idea that the difference between billion and million is that big. Now, do we have a poll question? Should we dare to run a poll?
Sure. Just bear with me 1 second. we're going to, I have the poll up and running here. Okay. And that poll, if everybody clicks to their right-hand side of their screen, they should see a poll that just popped up. And the poll is, were you surprised how long it took to spend $1 billion? So go ahead and you can submit your vote there. So we're showing that about 25% said yes, or 62.5% said yes, I was surprised. 25% said not really. 12.5% said yes, that was a big surprise, but no one knew that immediately. All right, back to sharing my screen.
Back to sharing your screen. Thank you. That's an example of what I mean by saying that most of us are not intuitive with numbers. We're not wired to do this. And in fact, there's a phenomenon called subitizing. And Kelly, I'm still waiting to see your screen.
Me too. It's coming. There we go.
All right, there we go. So subitizing is the phenomenon that when we are reading a kid's book and we see a picture of two goldfish, our brain immediately shouts out 2. And if we see 4 objects on a page, our brain immediately shouts out 4. But that process goes away somewhere around 5. Nobody subitizes for 70. Nobody subitizes for 15. And in fact, if you scroll up, most languages that have ever existed have numbers in the language for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But 6 through infinity, undergoing the generic label lots. Now you can imagine the difficulty of navigating in a culture that doesn't give you the cultural infrastructure to say anything other than 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. How many eggs did we get today, honey? Lots. Well, do we have enough to feed all the people that are coming over tonight? Well, we got lots of eggs. We've got lots of people. We'll see. And that's okay for a dinner party, but imagine the tragedy of showing up in mid-January and saying, what do we have to eat? We're out. But we had lots back in the fall. And so your ability to plan as a culture, your ability to coordinate as a culture is tied up in your ability to name and count numbers. And we celebrate geometry and we celebrate calculus, but counting is really the big win that humanity came up with. And unfortunately for us, when we're doing the little slide with the confusing blurb there, that's saying a billion and a million, we're essentially above our pay grade there. We've got lots. We know that's lots. And so what we're trying to do is get at, if you raise the, our brains are not wired for numbers. Math is like a second language. But I want to argue that good translations can help. And so let me pause for a second and see if that's making sense to Kelly.
Well, I think this is just so fascinating because I've always thought of myself as a math person, but it took me by surprise. So, what you did there is you took a domain where we do have a good intuition about magnitude and used it to kind of, tweak our feelings about the abstract numbers of millions and billions. You translate that into kind of a weak spot for math, into dimensions that we might not be so strong in. Is that what you mean by translation there?
That's exactly right. And so what you're doing is kind of hacking your brain. That there's a quantity out there that you're not quite understanding. You don't have a visceral sense about. But there are probably other things in life that give you that sense. And so the process of making numbers count is a process of translating them into a domain where we have more natural instincts about them. And it's not always possible, but it's possible most of the time. And what's surprising is the power of that result. Because all of a sudden you have math people that thought they knew what a billion and a million was going, wow, I didn't understand that. And you have non-math people, like I've told this to kids, and kids take pleasure in going around and tricking all the relatives that they have. It's almost like a great joke from a joke book where you get when you're in 7th grade. It's like, this is something that everybody gets wrong almost all the time. And the surprise expressions on your uncle's faces when you tell them that, all of a sudden kids get excited about math, even kids that are not necessarily numbers would have described themselves as in love with numbers. And so if we go to the next tier of slides, what I'm going to talk about first is how do we help people understand numbers more effectively. And there are a couple of processes that we're going to look at: making things concrete, making things human scale, and then converting to a process. So the first one we're going to talk about is making things concrete. And let me give you an example from my co-author, Carla. And the question that we're asking is, how big are the freshwater resources? How much water, in a world made of water, how much water do we have that actually supports life? Well, 97.5% of the water in the world is salinated. And so it's off the limits for humans and most of the animals, land animals that we know. Of the 2.5% that's fresh, 99% is sealed up in ice caps or in frozen tundra. So the 0.0025% remaining is good for consumption as long as it's not contaminated by chemicals or otherwise polluted. Now, let's take another translation that's more concrete. If we move the slides up. Imagine a gallon jug filled with salt water, and in it float 3 ice cubes, and we can drink the water that's coming off, the few drops of water that's coming off of each ice cube. That's all of a sudden a concrete way of talking about that same phenomenon that before was concerned with 99% and 97%, and there's 0.0025%, and our brains, even numbers-loving people, freeze up when we see that first translation of that set of numbers. But when we see the gallon jug with the 3 ice cubes and the drops coming off them, that's something not only can we understand and unpack what the responses was originally, but my co-author Carla remembered it from 20 years before when she had first heard it in class. It's a pretty good day's work as a teacher when you make an analogy, when you talk about something that sticks with people for 20 years. And we're more likely to do that if we can make things concrete. Let's raise to the next one. If I tell you that 40% of U.S. adults do not always wash their hands after using the bathroom at home, that's kind of an icky thing. But 40% is a vague number. And so here's what one graduate student did in one of our workshops. He said, imagine that 2 out of every 5 people you shake hands with may not have washed their hands between using the toilet and touching your hands. Now, that's the same 40%, and we're all smart enough people to convert 40% into 2 out of 5. But the act of making it concrete makes a huge difference in that. I mean, you just want to grab for the hand sanitizer of that. Sometimes the best number is actually no number at all. And so a few years ago, the New York Times published a state of the nation about how we're treating women in top management leadership roles. And it turns out that there are more Fortune 500 CEOs named James than there are Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. Now that's an egregious result. It says that there's still a lot of sexism in society. But there's no numbers associated with that. We don't have to unpack that there's 4.53% Jameses in the nation. It's just we know darn well that there ought to be more women around than Jameses. And the fact that we can't say that is a sign that our society has some ways to go. So what James is a concrete example of something that we might want to understand. But there are lots of concrete examples that are kind of silly that people use all the time when they're talking about numbers. So they talk about dollar bills stacked to the top of a national monument. They talk about dollar bills laid end to end and encircling the globe with numbers. Now, those are concrete images, but they don't connect with us. They're not anything that we would run into in daily life. They're not human scale. They're kind of magnitudes that are hard to imagine. So let's think about what it would take to make something human scale. And I want to challenge you to think about a hummingbird and the metabolism of a hummingbird. Because a hummingbird, a 5-gram hummingbird might consume 5 to 7 calories a day. And it's hard to get a sense of what that means, but let's take the typical American male, who looks a little more like the fellow on the right than on the left, I think. 199 pounds is what research tells us is the weight of the average American male. Now, what if we grew a hummingbird up to the size of an average U.S. American male? And it's 90 kilograms for those of you in countries that use reasonable metric systems. So 90 kilos, 199 pounds. Well, it turns out that American male would have to choose, and let's scroll up, 150,000 calories a day. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's converted to a process because it's hard to capture how many Cokes you'd have to drink in a day. But what you get basically do is you wake up from sleep, and in your first minute you're awake, you down a Coke. In the second minute you down a Coke, and you consume a Coke every minute for all waking hours. That all of a sudden gives you a different picture of how extreme the hummingbird metabolism is. And in fact, you could, if you scroll up one more time, you can imagine a class demonstration. And I'm not sure I would recommend this because I'm not sure what the human subjects participation requirements would be like this in terms of checking with parents for this. But you can imagine sitting down kids in a table and saying, okay, we're going to be a hummingbird for the next few minutes. And you give them a minute to down the first Coke in their six-pack, and then you give them a minute to down the second Coke. And somewhere around the second or the third, you're going to get some dropouts from that exercise. And people aren't going to be able to sustain it very long. And there may even be some vomiting, which is supposedly good for prom date stories. And so, maybe it'll work for a class demo. But let me tell you, that would be one of the most memorable demonstrations that anybody ever did with mathematics or science in a classroom. And so my recommendation to you is to make things human scale, to convert to a process, to give people a sense of what in their normal lives they can use as a brain hack for coming up with things that they're hard to picture otherwise. Let's scroll up again, Kelly, and then maybe take a question. Oh, there's a free book sign up. Right now on our website, I write typically with my brother Dan. This book we're talking about today is with Carla Starr, a science journalist. But at heathbrothers.com/numbers, there is a short questionnaire that will enable you to get your own copy, free copy of this book. And I want you to have it for what it's worthwhile to you in teaching the important things that you're trying to teach, for getting permission. Those of you that are working on the administrative side and campaigning for more funding for STEM education, I want you to have as much power behind the numbers that you talk about as possible. And so definitely sign up today for your free copy of Making Numbers Count. All right, Kelly, we're going to talk about motivation in addition to understanding. But do you have any questions for us?
Well, the hummingbird example just really resonates because I think it's something that when you see a hummingbird, you're always in awe going, look at how fast those wings are going. So, oftentimes we have those comparisons, and you said it before, like dollars stalked to the top of the Washington Monument, dollars placed end to end and wrapping around the world. And how many times would that happen around the globe? So if people were thinking human scale, they wouldn't be doing these things, right? We'd be trying to make it more applicable.
Yeah, and it's a simple concept, but it eliminates some bad ideas like the ones you just talked about, and it proposes some good ideas, like let's make the hummingbird the size of a person and see what would happen. Another one that we worked through for the paper is, if an NBA player could jump like a frog jumps, what would that look like? And so most dunks, like the famous picture of Michael Jordan with the ball in his hand and he's flying through the air and it's on every Nike shoe that is an Air Jordan thing. That picture is a picture of Michael Jordan dunking from the free throw line, which is 10 feet away, I think, from the basket. I'm not a basketball aficionado, but I think it's about 10 feet away. Take this 3-point line around the court, and that's farther enough away that you get 3 points for shooting from there as opposed to 2 points. Nobody's ever dunked from the 3-point line. The frog could dunk from the 3-point line. And in fact, the frog could dunk from the other team's 3-point line across the mid-court. Now, that's a huge distance. And next time you look at a basketball game, just imagine somebody dunking from the 3-point line of the opposite team into their basket, and you'll have a sense of what frogs can do. And so all of a sudden, we take very simple questions, and we develop more of a sense of awe and wonder about the world around us. And so this is where math comes into biology class. And if we start practicing this tendency of talking about human scale when we talk about biology, when we talk about engineering feats and accomplishments, I think that's going to make it more powerful for us.
Well, and I think it's interesting because so far we've really just talked about helping people to understand numbers, but now you're getting into this other provocative argument that the book talks about, is that numbers can actually make people care. It has that emotional touch And you basically recommend that when you're thinking about crafting a translation, it's something that has to motivate people.
Yeah, I think we don't think of numbers as emotional. In fact, we had an editor for our book that got through the first half of the book and he was cranking, he was doing good work for us. And then he got to the second half of the book about motivation and emotion. And he just couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to talk about or edit a document that was going to go out and tell people to make numbers emotional. And I kind of understand where he's coming from, because he's a very, very classic numbers oriented person that is just the facts, and the facts are all that's important. But if we think about are numbers motivational, the answer has got to be yes, because there are all kinds of goals that we have in society and in organizations that motivate us. The Guinness Book of World Records is one of the first things that Carl and I both fell in love with as kids that made us love numbers. And it's all about the best and the greatest and the longest and the most accomplished. And so there's no question that numbers motivate. The question is, do we have the skills to use them in that way? And so first thing, the principle I want to talk about is it's going to be hard to make numbers motivational, but we can do it if we tap pools of pre-existing emotion. And so actually we're not going to scroll up quite yet. So Ocean Spray Cranapple has 44 grams of sugar. The question is that a lot? Is that not much? And now we can scroll down. You've got an answer in mind. The answer is that's a good bit of sugar. And in fact, it's equivalent to 3 Krispy Kreme donuts plus 3 sugar cubes. Now, I don't know about you, but that's kind of a disgusting image, because the Krispy Kreme donuts are sugary enough, but imagine crunching a sugar cube along with one, and you've got the picture of that. And we think of that as a healthy beverage. The cranberry juice is pungent enough that we need extra sugar to offset the taste of the cranberries. Let's take another more serious example. In the United States, every year, sepsis kills 270,000 people. Kaiser Permanente in Northern California recently came up with a protocol that reduced the sepsis deaths by 55%. Now, what priority should that be in our medical revamp of adding things to medicine and getting hospitals on board? Well, if every U.S. hospital did this protocol with sepsis, we could save 149,000 lives a year. That's more lives than saving every woman with breast cancer and every man with prostate cancer combined. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't have much resonance with 149,000 lives. I don't know if it's a big number, but how big is it? And the comparison with prostate cancer and breast cancer all of a sudden makes clear to me in a way that I wouldn't have known before. This is essential. This is an essential issue. This is not something we do tomorrow. This is something we start today. Now, let me tell you a story about a change agent, Florence Nightingale. And that's her. She's the lady with the lamp. In the Crimean War, the British were competing or fighting the Russians, and the British had a coalition of people that were helping them. But what was happening is the conditions in the hospitals, in British hospitals during the Crimean War, were sufficiently bad that more boys were dying, more young men were dying in the hospitals than were being killed by the Russian soldiers. And Florence Nightingale, kind of an oppressed woman that had not experienced war before, but she volunteered to organize a group of about 35 women who went over to be nurses in the hospitals. And she came back and she was a hero because she had turned around the hospital. She had saved lots of lives. She was loved by the soldiers, loved by their parents. But she decided she wanted to change the cultural infrastructure that would prevent this from ever happening again. And so she had great statistics. She's one of the founders of the discipline of statistics. If you know that there are 190,000 cardiovascular deaths in the United States a year, that's because of record-keeping procedures that Florence Nightingale put in place along with one of her colleagues back at the time of the post-Crimean War. So she's founder of medical statistical record-keeping. She's a founder of statistical processes. But she knew that statistics weren't enough to convince the lords and the nobles and the generals to do things. She had to come up with motivational statistics. So what she did was use a variety of tactics to say, this is a number that you ought to pay attention to. And so at one point she says, look, in the early months of the Crimean War, we were killing off 600 per thousand of our soldiers. And that's worse than killing, if you scroll up, the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Now, that's a different way of looking at that number. Scroll up again. She said, and this was back during peacetime. Peacetime hospitals still hadn't solved the problem with transmission of disease and open wound infestation. She said, we might as well line up a bunch of 18, 19-year-old soldiers on Salisbury Plain and shoot them, 1,100 of them a year, because then their death would be more quick and painless than it's going to be in our hospitals where they're going to suffer from secondary infection. And Salisbury Plain was the very flat area. Stonehenge is actually located on part of Salisbury Plain, far away from this, but the reviews of the troops would go on in Salisbury Plain. So the troops are proudly marching and have completed their basic training, and they're proud to go off and serve their country in wartime. You just imagine lining up 1,100 of those boys and shooting them. And that's what she said we're doing. We're by neglecting the sanitation procedures that we need to put in place, we're effectively shooting 1,100 of our boys a year. Scroll up another. There's a famous example, kind of Titanic, for the culture of the time. There's a ship called the Birkenstock that sank. And it was filled with soldiers and filled with a few families that were there. And the soldiers gallantly ushered the women and children into the lifeboats, and then they sank with the ship, and 400 soldiers died. She said, she'd say to people, but notice we get upset about that and the tragedy of those 400 soldiers and sailors dying, but we're killing off 1,100 per year with bad procedures. Now, I love Florence Nightingale. I think she founded a brilliant profession. She was one of the major statisticians of her time, but I think she's even better at making ideas stick, because she figured out how to bring on emotion in numbers that otherwise wouldn't be emotional. And I don't think anybody could have listened to Florence Nightingale talk about those things that I just told you about and say, I don't get it. I'm just not a numbers person. Florence Nightingale forces you to acknowledge the emotion associated with what we're talking about in terms of the numbers. Let me give you a couple of other tactics that are a little more day-to-day. Add up the good stuff and category jump. A lot of you, there are teachers, know about do-nows. And so when kids come in, instead of letting them socialize for a few minutes before class starts, you put something on the board that gets them engaged in the material for the day. And so in a math class, you might say, show me 3 different rectangles that each have a perimeter of 100, but have different areas. And what happens if you do that do-now, kids are more engaged. They're ready to talk about the material by the time the teacher convenes the class to order. They've already thought about the subject of the day. And so saving 5 minutes per class, here are 2 different ways of talking about it. Saving 5 minutes per class sounds maybe important, but that's equivalent to adding 3 weeks to the school year. So if you add up all those small parts of goodness and combine them at the end of the school year, think of how many cool demonstrations or interesting topics you could add with another 3 weeks to play with. Here's another example of adding it. Go ahead. All right, so here's another one. Livestock are responsible for 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And you might read that and say, that's a little harder than I would have thought. But 14.5% doesn't sound like a lot until you start making comparisons. So you start adding up all those cattle around the world and thinking about what they constitute. If cows were a country, they would be the 3rd highest producer of greenhouse emissions among all nations. Cow Nation produces more emissions than Saudi Arabia or India and surpasses every country in the European Union combined. They lag only China and America. Now that's a stunning observation about Cow Nation. And it tells you that whatever happens with the discussion about climate change, we've got to treat the cattle industry as a serious component of that, as opposed to just something that would be good to get to eventually. They're producing more emissions than the European Union combined, all the countries there. And so that's a sign that there's something that we want to pay attention to. All right, let me stop there, Ms. Kelly. So these are all techniques. Are you buying the fact that you're a social entrepreneur? Are you buying the fact that statistics ought to be emotional?
I do. I mean, you look at this and you start to kind of think about things a little bit differently. It starts to drive that emotion. And, why does this work so differently than our normal intuitions, about, the way that we're thinking about these numbers? I mean, when you put out the Florence Nightingale example, that really kind of struck a chord with me, because then all of a sudden you realize it's about the saving lives. And so you start to think about numbers in a very different way.
Yeah. I think that's an important observation is numbers don't necessarily automatically connect with things that we care about. And so choosing that link between do nows may seem like they're saving a trivial amount of money, trivial amount of time, five minutes per class. But if you add that up over the course of a year, then it starts to get substantial. And you have to start seeing if we can move just a little bit faster in the early part of the year, we could have 3 weeks at the end of the year and do cool stuff that I've been wanting to do, but I've been telling myself I can't do because of the standardized test requirements. Let's talk about switching dimensions for a second. This is another technique for helping people understand, but it also helps you, in many cases, motivate people differently. So, for example, here's a statistic. The chances of death in a skydiving accident are approximately 8 in a million. 8 deaths per million skydives. Now, that's always made me pause before getting on a plane and going skydiving. But I'm going to tell you something that changed my mind. It's a demonstration that a friend of mine came up with. Scroll up a little bit and you'll see Harry Potter series on the left, beloved by many of you and by many of your kids in school and at home. And there are 7 volumes in that series. It turns out if you take out either volume 1 or number 2, what you're left with is 6 books that have approximately 1 million words in them. And so you can imagine thumbing through the pages of Harry Potter and marking out at random volumes, random pages, random words. If you scroll up, we're going to cross out, there's a little red X on the left, cross out 8 of those words in those volumes. And then we're going to put the volumes back together up on the shelf. And the way we're going to play the game of skydiving is you're going to go in, you're going to select a volume without looking, open the page without looking, put your finger down. If your finger lands on a word without an X on it, you're fine. In fact, you're better than fine, because everybody that has been skydiving that I know talk about it as a peak life experience. This is a bucket list moment for most people. And so the chances of skydiving in an accident is you hit one of those 8 words in the 1 million words, but you have 999,992 bucket list moments that are waiting for you. And I wish we had done a poll on this. Actually, can we put a poll up real quick?
Yeah.
I want to know how many people would that make you more likely to skydive? With the Harry Potter analogy with 1 million words, 8 words crossed out in a million, would that make you more likely to skydive? And just say yes or no as the answers.
Okay, just give me 1 second. Yes. And no. All right. We're going to. And it's open. So let's see what folks are saying. Oops, I'll close that one. All right. Would you skydive? Submit your voice now. Vote now.
And let's say more that would you be more likely to skydive using that Harry Potter analogy? If the skydiving companies had come up with that for them.
We're waiting for the results here. Drum roll.
Drum roll.
Let's see what it says. Well, we're still waiting those results because it's not active there. But we're going to have to come back and.
All right, we'll come back to that.
Yep, I'll keep an eye on that one.
All right, back to the slide presentation.
Here we go. All right, we're back.
All right, I see me, and there's the slides. One more time, I'm running a free book, sign up at heathbrothers.com/numbers. Okay, we can go on down to the next round. I wanted to talk for a moment about those of you that are fighting for the money and the resources to do what you're doing with STEM. And let me propose that there's a switching dimensions way of talking about budgeting and talking about benefits that I'd like to try out on you. So instead of talking about millions and billions and trillions of tax revenues and government expenses, why not switch dimensions and talk about something that we can understand that's human scale, and talk about the hours that we as citizens spend working on our jobs and how much of that money goes to taxes of various kinds. And so we work weeks, days, hours. How much time do we actually work for various things that happen in society? And so if you scroll up again, Kelly, the federal taxes that all of us are paying, essentially we spend 2 weeks on Social Security, we spend 2 weeks on Medicaid, Medicare, and so the first month of our life, we're not actually making money for our families, we're making money to help other people in society. National debt, we spend 3 days paying interest on national debt. We spend 7 days funding the defense arm of the U.S. government. Food assistance for poor people that can't afford food, we spend 2 days on that. National parks, we spend 1 hour. NASA, we spend 6 hours. I know the session before this was NASA. I have to admit, I've been a NASA junkie, NASA fan for years, because I grew up in Houston, Texas, close to the Johnson Space Center. They talked to astronauts. At one point, my family moved to New York City, and I was in school there when I was in first grade. And the principal called in my mom at one point because I was at confusion, because I said, my dad talked to astronauts. And my mom said, his dad does talk to astronauts. And that was so inconceivable to people in New York City at the time that it was amazing. That NASA was doing extraordinary things. And so I'm willing, NASA people, to work an additional day for you. 6 hours is what I'm currently working for you every year for your budget of $23 billion. I'm willing to double that. Now, as a side deal, we're going to have to talk about STEM resources. If you scroll to the next slide, right now, there's a total up at the top of that slide. It's in very micro font, but it's $23 billion. That's your budget for this fiscal year that you just negotiated with Biden. But down around the bottom is a yellow highlight that says STEM engagement, $127 million. Now, that sounds pretty good for STEM engagement. But I want to suggest that you ought to be doing better. And let me use as an analogy, as an emotional analogy. For every dollar you spend on STEM engagement, how much do fast food places spend on engaging in talking about their results to their customers? For every dollar you spend on outreach, McDonald's spends $6, and Taco Bell spends $47. Now, I want to suggest that the ideas that you have to talk about deserve more resources than Taco Bell. And so you're trying to talk about the Parker Solar Probe that has complicated experiments that it's doing with the sun and how the sun combusts and it's moving at 400,000 miles an hour, and it's a cool object. And what Taco Bell is talking about, can I scroll up, is the Quesarito. And basically the Quesarito is a quesadilla and a burrito, and they've got their own little equation on the right-hand side. Quesadilla plus burrito is amazing. But think of what their message is. We take some carbs and we fry them. And they fill them up with some greasy stuff, and then we fry them again. And then we melt some cheese all over it and fry it a third time. That's the message that they have to get across, and they're spending $47 to get it across to the American consumer. Well, the messages that we have in science are a little bit more complex. They deserve a little bit more time, and you deserve a little bit more resources for that. So if you scroll up one more time, what I'd like to get you is 6 times. But we're not going all the way for Taco Bell level expenditures, but at least you ought to be spending as much as McDonald's, getting your messages across at NASA, as opposed to messages that McDonald's are having. So let me close by saying nobody's a natural at numbers. Subitizing says we're great with 1 to 5. Most cultures that have ever existed in the world are really good at labeling things up to 5. But from 6 up to 600,000 to a billion, we're in a domain that humans aren't designed to tackle. On the other hand, there are things that you can do to get your numbers across. And so systematically thinking about making things concrete, systematically thinking about turning things into a process like the drinking Cokes for the hummingbird metabolism, systematically thinking about how do I tap into pools of emotion that are relevant and reasonable for the domain that I'm talking about, but might motivate people a little bit more, even if they think they're not a numbers person. And the final slide. Superman is a great character because he has X-ray vision. And I think the advantage is, if you're not a numbers person, the advantage of this approach to things is you rediscover the joy of numbers. You don't have to be a numbers person to appreciate the example of the hummingbird drinking 1,600 Cokes a day to keep up with hummingbird metabolism. You don't have to be a medically informed epidemiologist to understand that if sepsis is killing off more people than every woman with breast cancer and every man with prostate cancer, then it's a serious issue for our health system. And so Superman has X-ray vision. And if you're a numbers person, there's a sense in which you can see through walls. You can extrapolate trends that most people couldn't see. You can notice things that people wouldn't notice. It's one thing to have X-ray vision and see through the walls, and it's another thing to make the walls transparent so everybody else can see them. And hopefully, if you take some of these principles, make your numbers count, you're going to be making the walls transparent so that everybody else can see the wonder of the world, in the case of the hummingbird or the frog, or the tragedy of human behavior, as in the case of deaths from sepsis Florence Nightingale was tackling. So I hope that you're able to use this to do better with the messages that you're getting across.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate it. And I think, I've read your other books, and I think one of the things that I really see with this is that there is this enormous passion that you have for this book, because I think what it does, you're always about how things become more relevant. How are things more relatable? And I think that's exactly what this book has done in a very much needed area, because math is one of those things that so oftentimes we hear a student say, I'm not good at math, or a parent say, well, I wasn't good at math, so my child's not good at math. And we make that excuse. But when it becomes relevant, and that's what integrated STEM is all about, it's about making it relevant. It's about connecting the dots for kids. So now all of a sudden, as an adult, when you read this book, it's a way to make that translation for students. And so I just really want to applaud you for that. But I do want to ask that question is, what stirred you to write this book? Because it is different than the other ones that you've done.
I think it was kind of a passion project. And what we felt like when we did Made to Stick, which is about how to make ideas in general sticky, is that we kind of punted unfairly on numbers. And I would tell my students, engineers and MBAs come through my classes at Stanford, and I tell them, look, numbers are really hard. They're abstract. It's hard to make them stick. So focus in on one number and do the best you can. And eventually, one of my students stuck up his hand and said, look, I'm an investment banker. All that I deal with are numbers. I can't afford to avoid them. And so I was persuaded by my students to tackle the task of coming up with tools that they could use. And about 7 or 8 years later into that was when we started working on this book. But it was my students that forced me to ante up. If I was going to talk about making ideas stick, I couldn't leave off numbers.
Well, and I'm quite frankly really glad that they did, because as I said, this is just a very much needed topic there. And it's something that we all really need to connect more with, because as I said, as a country, math is critical. It's critical to us to stay afloat, and we need to think about things more differently. The other thing I wanted you to just share, because you and I had this conversation about statistics. We were talking a little bit about how, they tend to use calculus as this whole gateway and statistics. And I just want your viewpoint on, what do you think about statistics, especially as you were writing this book?
Oh, I'm a huge fan of more statistics education. I think there's a great podcast by the Freakonomics guys where they looked at the top 10 fastest growing professions. And about 7 of the 10 are arguably about translating numbers from statistical database management or statistician, and we don't have tools for that, and we don't teach people to do that. And so in graduate school, I took about 4 statistics classes. I took 0 classes, and even 0 days in any of those classes about how to convey the statistics once you calculated the right answer. And so I'm really good at getting the right answer coming out of graduate school. I'm really awful at talking to students about it or my fellow researchers about it or whatever. And I think that's a tragedy, because all the emphasis we put on analytical skills and STEM education, it's valueless if we can't convey it to somebody else.
Yeah. And, just one final comment that I just wanted to share, and just as a question that came up is, so, the hope of this, because even, with your previous books, I mean, you really had this great passion of, if students were doing more of those hands-on activities, right? If students were just more engaged in their learning and those powerful moments that they would have. And if we could translate those powerful moments from 1 day a year to 3 days a year to 4 days a year, that transformation would be huge. Mm-hmm. And so talk about how we can take and create those powerful moments with this new book, Making Numbers Count.
Yeah. I think one of the most fun exercises that we went through as researchers is, we said, Usain Bolt is really fast. But what if we ran Usain Bolt against the best that the animal kingdom had to offer? And so imagine a 100-meter dash between Usain Bolt and a rhinoceros and chimpanzee. And to make it fair, we're going to let people let the species get up to high speed before they have to run their 100 meters, but they've got to run 100 meters continuously. It turns out that Usain Bolt, who is the best that we have to offer of 9 billion species members, right? Our best comes in a microsecond ahead of the chimpanzee, just a typical chimpanzee. But both of them were trounced by the rhino, which, if you look at it in the books, looks pretty sleepy and pretty slow. But the rhino is like 3 seconds ahead of the pack. And what was amazing about that is we immediately had to start asking about other things. And it turns out there's a desert ant that is able to run 100 body lengths of itself in a second. And so the desert ant would actually do very well, and he's completely off the radar screen of most individuals. And so what I love about that is there are things that you can do, things that you can pose to your class that evoke curiosity and are researchable on the internet. And so you can have an NBA Final Four, approach to NCAA Final Four approach to brackets of animals, and I think that's something that students would get engaged by and benefit from, because they're doing their own research, they're converting their own numbers, but there's a purpose for the math, and they start seeing the purpose for the math. Just like those of you that are working for robotics clubs and other, there are problems that you can solve with math that you wouldn't have thought about until the teacher poses them to you, and then you feel like a scientist because you're using the math to discover the world.
Well, I want to thank you for this amazing opportunity. I want to encourage everyone to please take up Chip Heath on this amazing book. This is a must read for all educators. I think so often math tends to be something that we struggle with in terms of teaching. And I think this is a way, even if we're the best math teacher in the whole wide world, it's a way to make this relevant. And so I want to encourage everyone. I haven't finished the book to the end, but I'm in it and I love it and I get excited about it. And then when I share these little stories, everybody looks at me and they're like, wow. So I'm having a good time. So I like to read it in little sections there, and then I like to share my knowledge. So, as Chip,
making yourself better at the dinner table or cocktail party is an important part of it.
I have really good talking points right now, so we got to get together. So I want to thank you, as always, just so much, and it was just so incredibly kind of you to share this. We will have this as the live broadcast as well, and we may do with our slides to the best that we can. And so hopefully it'll work when we also share this out. So without further ado, I want to thank Chip. Also, if Cristiano, Lima, if you are in the audience right now, we'd love to invite you backstage so we can get you on stage, because that's who we're going to hear from next. We're going to look through STEM through the eyes of Gen Z. And this is going to be really interesting. He's been looking at tracking young people's perceptions of STEM. So as we continue to go through this learning journey, let's hear for Cristiano. So just give us one moment here, and we'll jump over to the agenda there. And again, please go to heathbrothers.com/numbers. You have to get this book. And if not, you can always email me as well. We'll be putting together a list too. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Chip Heath.